Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. This week, the cover piece is Go, Why the Rich Are Fleeing Britain. Now, to discuss this, I'm joined by the author of the cover piece, our new economics editor. Are you still new?
I think I'm new for like 6 months.
Okay, fine. Yeah. You got a probation.
Probation, yeah.
Our new economics editor, Michael Simmons. Now, Michael, just to start off with, what's the imagery behind the cover?
So the idea behind the cover is it's Monopoly themed, although Hasbro, please do not sue us. And so you've got, for instance, the community chest there, and obviously everyone knows the Go Square, collect £200 as you pass Go. And the point is that, as I reveal in the piece, and as I'm sure we'll get into, the super rich are fleeing Britain and they're taking their assets, their wealth, and crucially their taxes with them.
How bad is it? What is the scale we're talking?
So the rich, and I should say what I mean by the rich. So the people that track this use a definition of people who have got liquid assets of over $1 million. And we use dollars because they don't just track this for the UK, they track it for all sorts of countries, because those with the broadest shoulders, as as Keir Starmer likes to say, also have the longest legs. So this is a mobile group of people. These people have been sort of leaving, so we've had a net outflow of high net wealth individuals since about 2016. But in the last year of data, it's really exploded. London alone lost over 11,000 dollar millionaires. So the number of people giving up on Britain and going just really has accelerated. And
so what happens here is the rich leave. The rich are the ones that are paying the most taxes, and maybe you could explain a bit of statistic-wise, and then what are the repercussions when we don't have as much going into the tax revenue?
So we reveal some stats in the piece. The Treasury and HMRC always publish the how much the top 1% of earners contribute in income tax. So that's a known figure already. And that's about a third, so almost a third of all income tax that goes into the inland revenue comes from just the top 1% of taxpayers. But what we reveal in the piece is from this Freedom of Information request that our brilliant Director of Research, John O'Neill, did about what happens when you zoom in even further. So if you look at the top I'm going to get this wrong, it's either the top 0.1% or the top 0.01%. Yeah. Go and look at the piece to check it out. But one of those two counts for just about 4,000 people. But they still bring in 6% of the tax take. Now, what that means is what that means in practical sort of cash terms, that's about 4 million each. So if just one of those people left, then it would take 1,300 ordinary taxpayers to replace them. So in other words, we'd need to create 1,300 new jobs that were paying enough to go into income tax to replace just one of those people. And as I also reveal in the piece, there's multiple people that we know for a fact have left, regardless of what the sort of survey data shows. And then obviously on to your second point about what this means for the UK. We've talked on Spec TV before, we've written on the website and indeed the magazine many times about, the dire fiscal position that Britain's in, the challenges that the Chancellor has about keeping her headroom and balancing the books to pay for the ever-expanding size of the state, whether that's for benefits, for, NHS, these are bottomless pits of money. And why this is an issue now is if you look at last year's tax take, the government makes all the decisions based on what the OBR, so the Office for Budget Responsibility, expects it will get in tax revenue and what it will have to borrow. And last year it had to borrow £15 billion more than had been forecast. And a large part of that is the tax take being lower than expected. Now there's a number of factors to that. Part of it's to do with weak economic growth. But I posit in the piece that part of the tax take dropping is because of these wealthy taxpayers leaving Britain.
How significant was the decisions around the non-DOMs that Rachel Reeves changed in the autumn statement?
Yeah, so it is exactly the non-DOMs. That is what has set people off. I've heard discussions about, people are a bit upset about the VAT on private schools, issues with changes to capital gains tax and income tax. But when I spoke to wealthy individuals, but also wealth managers and lawyers for non-doms for doing research for the piece, they all came down to the non-dom reform. Now, in fairness to Rachel Reeves, the non-dom regime was actually abolished by Jeremy Hunt in the spring budget last year in a sort of act of desperation, really. One of the people I spoke to made the point that the wealthy people have always seen the Tories as kind of their defenders of wealth creation, the defenders of people who they would say have earned money, and they were sort of abandoned as the Tories sort of threw the kitchen sink at trying to not be wiped out in the election. But what Rachel Reeves then did, which is what they say has really sort of killed the game for wealth in Britain, is this technical sort of point, which is called grandfathering. So when you set up when you set up a trust for inheritance tax purposes, it's not unusual that the government makes reforms. So we first saw the regime that governs inheritance tax and trust changed in 1980, and then again by Gordon Brown and also by George Osborne. But grandfathering was this accepted convention that if you changed a trust or changed the rules around how trusts are taxed or what's taxed, it would only apply to trusts created after that date. And I think people would just see that as a
it wouldn't be backdated.
Exactly, it wouldn't be backdated, it wouldn't be retroactive. But what Rachel Reeves has done is she said the changes she made were basically that inheritance tax will now apply to worldwide assets. But rather than, and that follows on from what Jeremy Hunt did. But what Rachel Reeves did is she said, we're getting rid of grandfathering. This is going to apply to all your wealth that's already in the trust. Which means that if you're a non-dom that's moved over, that's emigrated into Britain, your wealth that you've created or you've made or earned or been given, whatever, however you got it, in other countries, before you ever set foot in Britain, could now be taxed under inheritance tax. And that is what these people say they just cannot put up with.
And it's interesting because you mentioned in the piece that HMRC were warned about this, and they travelled across England before the autumn statement to the north, spoke to wealth advisors who all said you are going to have a situation where the wealthy are going to leave Britain.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So there was a consultation process with the wealth management industry where they all made this point that whatever you do, like, fair enough, we've lost the argument on whether the wealthy should be taxed more, etc., but you must keep this grandfathering point. And not only that, I know for a fact that during the election, Rachel Reeves, I can't say if the Chancellor personally saw this email, but her team was emailed, to give this warning. And Rachel Reeves' team and the Treasury have completely ignored it. And this is really because Labour were relying on... Fans of the Spectator from the COVID days will know of my obsession with dodgy modelling, often from the University of Warwick. And those guys, obviously, although a different team completely, have struck again. Labour were relying on this paper put together by economists from the University of Warwick and also the London School of Economics. And that said that of about the 70,000 non-doms that are in Britain, the tax changes would just mean that 70 would leave. So basically, who cares? 70 very rich people who don't have great ties to Britain are pissing off. Does it really matter? But privately, at least one of the authors of that study has admitted they made some mistakes. And effectively, it was a static model. It didn't really take in proper behavioural responses. And specifically, it didn't look at this grandfathering point. And so there's other modelling that I've mentioned in the piece has also been reported in some other places that suggests that far from bringing in money to the Exchequer by tightening up the tax regime, it could actually cost us billions and billions, not even to mention jobs lost from the companies that will move.
Yes, I had a look at this line that you had in your piece, Michael, because I think what you've said is they've suggested that it could raise £10 billion, and then when the assessment is redone, actually the cost could be over 12.2 billion. Is that right? And I want to bring up some of your sage modelling rage, because what this seems to me is that you're looking at a worst case scenario situation. But actually, they're also looking at a best case scenario situation, and it could be anywhere in between all of these. There are so many different variabilities.
So you're saying I've cherry picked a stat to fit my argument?
I think you could be catastrophizing the situation.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's you're completely fair to say, how can I just discount the model that they've relied on, but say, well, this model's golden. Whilst I would argue that some of the other models I use to back up my case, I think are better because they do consider the dynamics effects of taxation. So they examine the behavioural response. It's a valid point. You know, I'm critical of modelling in general. I can't just say, even though this one's slightly better, that means it's right. But I would go back to the point I made you at the start about how if even one or two people leave, it counts for millions of pounds. And my anecdotal reporting in the piece gives examples of people who have left or are going to leave. So we know this is happening. We know from wealth management firms that loads of their clients are leaving. One particular firm, who I can't name, has basically just moved to Geneva, moved all their staff because all their clients have gone. So the models might argue about how many people specifically have gone. I don't think there's much argument about the cost implications, because the bit that changes that variable is about whether or not people actually leave. And I think the wider reporting suggests that bit is true. They are gone.
Have your calculations taken into consideration the people that are coming into Britain and the businesses that is coming into Britain? I mean, just last week, I think I read somewhere that a Brazilian bank has signed off a lease of the most expensive rent ever in London. So there's still a lot of wealth and business coming back into London at the same time.
Well, again, look, this is a flaw of any modelling. I believe the one of the ones I mentioned does look at that, and they all assume that there's not going to be a great inflow. I mean, just yesterday it was floated, and we write about this in the Spectator's economics newsletter today as well, that the government's looking at bringing in an investor visa to attract these people back. And if that works, and as you say, businesses and wealthy people are pouring into the UK, then perhaps my thesis is entirely wrong. But I would refer you to some quotes from the two people I spoke to for the piece, two people that are in the wealth management industry. And I said that point, you know, what if the government just decided to revert on its policies or decided to create a regime that attracted rich people? And they would say that the damage is already done, because if you are a wealthy individual, you're an investor, you manage your family wealth, or you're a business owner or whatever, what's more important to you than having a competitive tax regime is having certainty about planning your finances. And one person actually said to me that the worst thing the government could do could be to flip-flop and try to attract them back, because then we just look unserious. These people plan on 10, 20-year horizons. So if they think, oh, the tax policy changes every year, then that's going to put people off even more.
Gary Stevenson, the YouTuber who has grown huge popularity, made a video recently about, you know, are the rich leaving Britain and what are the consequences? And when he talks about taxing the wealth, the point, and he made a very similar point to you at the beginning, which is that I want to separate between the two different types of wealth. He says, I wouldn't want to put taxes on the people that are working, high net earners, but actually we should be taxing assets in Britain, and because those assets aren't going anywhere, they can't leave Britain. They're in most cases in situ. What do you think of that argument? Because he seemed to believe that taxing them would put a stop to any sort of capital flight.
Yeah. Well, look, I understand why people see the appeal of Gary's message and why you might want to target the wealthy and assets. And by the way, to be clear, I don't have personal sympathy, and I don't expect readers to have personal sympathy for the ultra rich feeling they're hard done by. I mean, I live in a mouse infested flat share in a part of London that regularly has IRA stronghold graffitied on the wall. You know, I don't feel sympathy for these people. But the fact is, we need them. I think Gary's completely wrong that they can't move assets. These people are incredibly mobile, specifically the non-doms, who obviously by definition came here at some point. these people are accustomed to leaving and to taking their assets with them. I think they're selling up their properties. Another stat in the piece is that some of the places that you think are the most expensive parts of London, Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster, etc., they're seeing house prices drop actually at the fastest rate compared to other parts of the country where house prices are going up. And on the general point of, the rich should be taxed more, well, I don't think anyone would argue that against the fact that they should take the brunt. But in Britain, if you actually look at individual taxes, so not the overall tax burden, which, as we say on the Spectator all the time, is at a post-war high.
Yeah.
If you look at individual taxes, for lower earners and medium sort of income earners, the tax rate compared to the size of the state is not actually that high compared to, say, some European countries. Yeah. But the top percent of earners have really been squeezed. I tried to remember this, but I couldn't, so I've written it on a nice Spectator postcard.
Refresh your notes.
Yeah. At the start of the 90s, someone with a salary in the 99th percentile, which is about £54,000, they paid 36% of their salary in tax. That same percentile now, obviously we've had inflation and stuff, so that salary is more like 200 grand. They pay 42% of their income in tax. So this is it's just a myth to say that we haven't been going after the high earners or the wealthy individuals. We've squeezed them more and more, and the pips are beginning to squeak.
You spoke to Charlie Mullins, who is one of the millionaires that has left Britain and divides his time between Spain and Dubai. And he said he's not going to come back in a Labour government and will only return if reform get in. And I'm interested to know what you think of that, because whilst, yes, you talk about Rachel Reeves's budget and all the damage that the Chancellor has done, it is very politically unpopular for, say, Reform or the next government to come in and create changes that create tax incentives for the rich to remain in Britain. So how does the next government get around that?
Well, look, you're right. I mean, the beauty of journalism is we can just shout about problems without having to actually be the people that come up with the solutions. So, like, I obviously have sympathy with whoever the government is and whoever is occupying number 11 with how you do this, because, as you say, it would be politically very, very difficult to say we actually need to really attract these people. And in fact, even though I think some people in number 10 knew that this was going to lead to an exodus, when sort of privately they're asked about it, people in number 10 will say, well, it polls well, so we've got to do it. I think there is a way that you do it, and you present it as part of a suite of reforms. So we say we want to change the size of the British state. It's grown too big. We want to make it smaller. We want to make it nimble. We want to make it efficient to basically improve everyone's living standards. And that would improve tax benefits for people across the income spectrum. So it'd be a whole suite of measures. And as part of that, you would include, and you would present it as, we want the brightest brains, the richest investors to move here. And by the way, there's a great opportunity. There's lots of very wealthy American academics, business owners who are anti-Trump, who don't like some are maybe a bit hyperbolic about the way America is going. And there's an opportunity to present this as not as, right, we just want any rich people here. We're going to specifically try to attract these Americans. So I think there's ways you can dress it. There's ways you can handle the cons. But I wouldn't argue with your point. Of course, it's very politically difficult.
Final point, Michael, I want to ask you about billionaires, because the Sunday Times Rich List has seen that we've had the greatest fall in billionaires in Britain in history. How much of a problem is that? And does the world need billionaires?
Well, this proves my point, right? Like they're going, and again, it's back to the point I keep reiterating. They're responsible for so much of the tax take. If they go, what is going to happen is if they go and the size of the state remains as big as it's become since COVID. So if we continually expect more and more from welfare, more and more from the NHS, if these people are gone, there is no one left to tax, which means the basic rate of income tax, and people around Westminster and Whitehall will tell you, as much as the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are ruling out changes to income tax, eventually someone is going to be forced to put up the basic rate by 1 or 2%. And if you argue for a more Scandinavian style state and economy, and you're aware of that, then fine. But I think most people who make these arguments that people should be taxed more don't mean themselves. So that's where we're getting to. In terms of, do we need billionaires, or should we have billionaires like in general? I mean, obviously, look, that's like obscene levels of wealth that the vast majority of people are never, ever, ever going to attain or experience. But if we have a system that we live in, capitalism, that has actually, improved our lives, improved the human condition, over hundreds of years, better than any other idea or ideology that's been put forward, then you're just going to have them. They're a fact of the system, and so therefore, it's not something to do away with.
Very thought-provoking piece, Michael. Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. And to our viewers, if any of you are millionaires and thinking of leaving Britain, please do get in touch and tell us why you are. Or if you're not and you're going to stay, let us know about that as well. Tell us your thoughts about Michael's piece. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and join us again next week.